So what I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about, I'm deciding the Polychaetes, which are what these two pictures are of here, and a little bit about the classification and breakdown, but not as much as I had planned, and I'll talk about why in a minute. Okay, so we're looking at annelids, and in the previous lecture I gave the basics of the overall body plan and the breakdown of the levels of tissue and so forth. Mostly that was focused on the oligochaetes, which are the earthworms. All right, so earthworms are mostly terrestrial, some are freshwater, so terrestrial. And freshwater, and they display the basic classic characteristics that we look at when we're talking about the phylum Annelida. That's usually what we're using as the model organism for that group are the oligochaetes. Now, there are a lot of other members of the phylum Annelida, and one of the problems is the reason I kind of redrew cladogram and phylogenetic tree multiple times and erased it and decided to go with just this model that I have here. It's partly because this group has had more phyla added to it as classes, has had some of the classes combined, has had them split apart, had another group added to it, the Sapunculids, and it was pulled out as another. So there's a lot of confusion about who's related to who. There's a core group of organisms that have long been thought of as being closely related, belonging to the annelids. There's a whole bunch of other organisms that were their own phyla. Sometimes they were brought into the annelid and so forth. In any case, we're not going to focus on all those different groups. I'm just going to try to stay focused on the body wall structure, and I'm going to talk about the polychaetes just because they're very interesting marine worms. They're very common in the marine environment, so these are going to be all marine in the oceans. And we kind of have two sort of subgroups of them. All right, so these are polychaetes, also known as bristle worms. There are errant polychaetes, and then sedentary polychaetes, which are often the tube worms. Now, there's another group of animals that are also called tube worms. There are a group that was called the Vestamintifferin worms, and then the Parapodia worms. They were their own phyla. More recent ones, they were then brought into the annelids as a group, and now they're kind of under the polychaete class. So these are the worms that live at hydrothermal vents, and the way they're modified is that they have bacteria living in a gut cavity, so they don't really have a mouth. They're kind of absorbing nutrients from outside into this gut cavity where the bacteria will metabolize in a unique way, giving them their food and nutrients. So they're so odd in their structure that people thought they were very different, a completely different group of organisms. Eventually they found some of the small segments that are the different septated segments of a segmented worm, like a polychaete. They live inside these tubes, and then when studying their reproductive biology, finding they have a similar type of larval form and so forth, then people started to put it together and look at other molecular relationships. So mentioning that larval form, this is something that is common in this group, and then a couple of the related groups. So I'll spend a minute or two talking about it. Okay, this looks like a little top with a little ciliated ring, and this would go all the way around it. Okay, so this ring would come all the way around, and they would have a mouth that would go into a little mini digestive cavity that would come out here. All right, and this is our Trochophore Larvae. So the Trochophore larvae is a free-swimming larvae that's a characteristic of the polychaetes, but we also see it in the mollusks as well. So mollusks, when we get into that phylum, are sometimes seen as closely related phyla for a number of reasons, and one of them is they go through a similar stage in development. But we'll talk about them separately. So this trochophore is a feeding larvae. So feeding larvae we call planktotrophic. Planktotrophic. So that means feeding, which means the larvae actually has to feed while it's swimming around in the water column. They are another type of larvae called lethotrophic, and the lethotrophic usually they do not feed, and they rely on kind of a really large yolky egg mass from the mother, whereas these don't. So with the polychaetes, usually we have separate sexes. So some male, some female. And they have a variety of different ways in which they reproduce. Generally, they spawn or release the sperm and eggs out into the water column where fertilization occurs there, and then it develops eventually through embryonic development into the trochophore larvae, which then swims around until it gets a signal, usually to metamorphose, and then it metamorphoses into a little juvenile of the animal. So it might metamorphose into a juvenile who's an errant polychaete. So the errant polychaetes it means that they kind of run around, they swim, they're active, moving about. Okay. Generally, these are predators. So they actually have jaw-type structures that can bite. The CD on their Parapodia help them swim, and so that's what these little structures that look like a little leg sticking off the side of him here. These are their Parapodia. They act like little paddles, okay, and they can move and help the animal both crawl. Some of them crawl around on the sediment, and some of them and swim through the water column. So they both undulate their body movement, and they can use these sort of parapodial appendages like little paddles in the water as well. They have the little cedal extensions off of them, and then many times the entire body is also covered with CD, again making them very bristly, and those bristles themselves can break off and cause injury to a potential predator. So a predator would try to eat them, and then they get stuck in the mouth with all these little bristles. Some of them also contain toxins, so the bristle is then lined with toxins, and then they irritate the tissues of, again, a potential predator. So they're used in a defensive strategy most of the time. Now, what we have are then the sedentary or the tube worms, who are filter feeders. So they have the body broken into segments, and they do have CD. Usually the Parapodia are greatly reduced, so or lacking, so they don't have lacking, but they still do have CD. They're still covered in the CD along their body, just typically not as much, right, as the errant polychaetes would be. And then they have modified appendages here that form these tentacles. And the tentacles are used sort of in more passive filter feeding. So things float by in the water column, they're captured, and then they're passed down the tentacles to the mouth. And then the animal has a digestive system, a complete digestive system that would be running through it, just like we looked at in the other worms as well. So although they might eat the larvae, they might eat animals, they might eat other organisms that are small, tiny little organisms. We don't call them predators because they don't actively go out and capture them. They are filtering them out of the water in a more passive way, whereas these are more active, moving around, capturing their food and killing it and eating it, and that's usually what we call a predator. Some of them are detritivores and eat already dead material as well. So the polychaetes can comprise a large number of the marine species of annelids and a variety of different styles. And there are some other groups of worms, like I said, that were considered one group or another, that some of them have been folded into the polychaetes. But these are sort of the most classic, common groups. These here, the tube builders, An interesting thing about the tubes, some of them secrete the tube themselves, so they actually secrete the material from their body that actually builds the tube around them. Some of them are soft, like parchment or paper-like, and some of them are hard, like the shell of a snail. Okay, and they're made out of different variety of different kinds of material. Some of them don't secrete the actual tube itself, but they secrete an adhesive, and the adhesive then binds to grains of sand and other material to actually build their tube. So they build the tube out of sediment and other materials, but they secrete a glue that kind of puts it together. So it's kind of interesting. A variety of them use a variety of different strategies to build these tubes and live inside them. And then they can pull them tentacles inside the tube very fast in order to hide from predators, would bite and take off the tentacles. So usually these are not protected against predators in terms of having a CD on them or anything toxic. It's just more the way that they are sensitive to predators is that they have eye spots. So you can see that in the errant these little dots I drew here are little eye spots, eyes, and these guys have them too. So they can detect light and movement really well. So especially for these here, when something starts to move by them and cast shadow, they'll just pull inside. These will use that in order to move around a lot more actively, and so their eyes tend to be more well developed than the tube worms. So a lot more potentially to talk about them, but that's just for you the little overview of one major group of annelids are called the Polychaetes. Another major group of annelids are called the Oligochaetes, which are the earthworms. And then there's another major group called the Hirudinea, and these are the leeches. Leeches are generally freshwater, so they typically do not find them in marine environments or terrestrial environments. They live in water, and it tends to be fresh water. The leeches are a little bit different, and sometimes the leeches are just pulled in with the oligochaetes. They're just a subgroup of oligochaetes, and other times they're their own separate class. I'm not being really specific with class and the taxonomic levels here because it's something that people continually alter a little bit. But generally they still continue to use these names. They just assign it a different ranking level. So the leeches are typically parasites, but they're temporary parasites. Some of the other groups of organisms we talked about, when they parasitize internally a host organism, they live their whole life inside that host, or they require that host in order to live. They would die, without the host. The leeches are sort of feeding more on another organism by attaching to them, damaging the tissue and pulling blood and fluids from that host. But it's a temporary type of attachment. Once they're full, they then drop off. All right, so they don't have a permanent relationship with their host. It is more temporary. The other thing about the leeches is that internally, they're not segmented. So they do not have the septa dividing them up. So that's something important to note. No internal septa. Kind of pull them out. So that's kind of the thing that would separate them from these. These haven't. The Polychaetes have internal septa. The Oligochaetes have the internal septa, but the Hirudinea do not have the internal septa. So it pulls them out as their own separate group. That's all I'm really going to go into with these just for this particular class. Like I said, because I had planned on covering a lot more in terms of the classification, and ultimately decided, based on all the different things I was reading, it's a little just too complicated, and there's not quite a consensus on it. Generally, even your book was just almost saying just Polychaetes and Oligochaetes, and that's it. And then they're just throwing the leeches in there, but didn't quite say where they belonged, except maybe with the Oligochaetes. And then other sources had a whole list, a gigantic phylogenetic tree here with all different members of the annelids. So for our class, we're just going to keep it at these with these three groups. Okay.